Hello everyone, welcome to our series of videos understanding CBET. In the previous video, we looked at the first principle of CBET, and that is industrial alignment. And we looked at different areas on how we're able to involve with the industry through development of occupational standards and curriculum. And today, we want to focus and start our discussion in the second principle of CBET, and that is clear, measurable learning outcomes. And we are going to unpack these principle and just understand what a clear, measurable learning outcomes are. So to start, we need to understand what we mean by learning outcomes. And these are statements that describe what learners will be able to do. So you're focusing on performance, the ability of a learner to be able to do a particular task. And usually after completing a particular program or occupation. Remember when you talk about CBET, we talked about focusing on the ability of this learner to be able to perform a task. So these learning outcomes are usually written in terms of specific competencies or tasks that learners will able to perform. And I think we overemphasize on the CBET approach on why competency is being stressed. Of course, we'll be discussing knowledge, but more emphasis on skills and attitude. So basically, that's what a learning outcome is. And in the context of realigning our courses, our occupation to the industry requirements, you realize these learning outcomes are derived from occupational standard. And at this juncture, probably to remind ourselves uh, what we actually looked at in occupational standard. And we say that occupational standards have unit of competency, and those are what that learner should be able to perform. And of course, to be able to perform that duty, we looked at elements, and those elements are coupled with performance criteria. And when we're discussing about the curriculum, we say that elements are the learning outcomes when coming to writing our curriculums. And therefore, we realize these learning outcomes are the elements in occupational standard. And learning outcomes are clearly communicated to learners through various means. One is through content delivery. So at the time you're able to communicate, I mean, rather to develop or to deliver contents, that is what we call communication. So you're able to deliver the content that align to a particular learning outcomes. And it's also good to understand that learning outcomes are consistently measured by assessment. And we're going to talk about assessment, like we said. And the only way to understand that your learning outcome have been achieved is through assessments. So basically, that's what a learning outcome is and how we're able to measure them. So generally, CBET programs are designed to ensure that learners acquire the three prongs of education or learning on what we know on knowledge, skills, and of course values or attitude, usually that are necessary to be successful in a workplace. So you need these three items for you to be successful in any workplace. You need to have the knowledge, the technical know-how, and that is the skills, your ability to be able to perform something, and having the right attitude towards that occupation. And therefore, as such, learning outcomes in CBET are typically aligned with the needs of industry. And we'll be talking about industry in every principle that we're going to unpack, because our main essence is to realign all our courses, all our programs that we offer in this institution to able to be realigned with the requirement of the industry. So industry is a very critical component for CBET programs. And realize that learning outcomes as a share of correlation between two aspects, and that is assessment and content delivery. So when I talk about teaching and learning activity, are usually aligned with the learning outcomes. And therefore, when you're talking about learning outcome, we looked at what we call constructive alignment. It affects in a cyclic way the assessment, teaching, and learning activity in class. So the idea of planning for a session using different teaching methods is usually based on the learning outcomes. And the learning outcomes is also going to tell you how to assess that particular learning outcome. And therefore, you realize that learning outcome is a very important component of CBET because it affects your methodologies of training and the major aspects of assessment. So there's a serious correlation between the three aspects, that is the learning outcome, content delivery methods, and assessments. But of course, when you're talking about learning outcomes, it has its own importance. One, it helps to ensure that learners develop skills and knowledge that they need to be successful in a particular occupation. And I think you have talked about that. It provides a framework for designing and delivering effective CBET programs because you are focusing on the outcomes. Is a learner able to perform certain duty with the right attitude that are required? Again, is realize learning outcomes allow for the assessment of learner progress and achievement. And the only way to understand, to measure ability of a learner is just through assessment. And we're going to look at different assessment methods that you can employ in achieving or in measuring the learning outcomes. Of course, there are many other importance, so the three suffice for now. Again, when talking about learning outcomes, there are usually consideration that you need to focus on. One, your learning outcome should be able to be specific, should be measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So when you talk about the SMART acronym, that our learning outcome should be well specified, should be clear, and you should be able to measure at the end of the day that learning outcome. So measurability is a very key component that again you're going to focus on. Should be achievable. And it's very important to understand that achieving a learning outcomes means a lot for this learner. So which method are you going to use to achieve that learning outcomes? Relevancy, of course, you have talked about industry alignment. Are they realigned to the industry requirement? Are they relevant for that particular duty to be performed? And of course, issues in regard to time. Another consideration is should be aligned with the needs of the industry. Again, you can see the industry coming in. Learning outcomes should be aligned to the industry requirements. Another focus is should be able to be written in terms of what learners will able to do. Again, you're talking about performance based. You want to measure competency rather than what the learner they will learn. So again, knowledge. But the more focus is what a learner is able to do. Of course, there are many other considerations, but let's focus on the three. Our learning outcome should be smart, should be aligned to the industry requirements, and should be able to be written in terms of what a learner is able to perform. We talked about clear, measurable learning outcomes. So these are clarity that we're talking about is an essential component of learning outcomes for effective teaching and learning. So all our learning outcomes need to be very clear as per what the industry requires. So by writing clear learning outcomes, trainers can help learners to achieve their full potential. So it's very important you get it right during development of occupational standards. And that brings me to what we call domains of learning, because you're going to use different verbs that measures a particular level of knowledge or affective domain or psychomotor domains. So it's good to understand the Bloom taxonomy when it comes to how you derive your learning outcomes. So you factor in issues of cognitive domain, psychomotor domains, and of course the affective domain. And at this juncture, it's also good to mention something about Bloom's taxonomy so that we're able to measure different levels of understanding. So we have the knowledge, and of course, which are the right verb to use for that, comprehension, which are the right verbs to use, because those verbs affect your training methodology and your assessments, application, analysis, evaluation, creation. So as you're moving to the higher levels of cognitive domains, you're able to see different verbs. And when you have such verbs, then affects how you deliver your content and how you're able to measure the learning outcomes. It's good to understand how to derive learning outcomes using the various Bloom taxonomical verbs, the actual verbs. Brings me to a point on what are the parts of a learning outcome. It has three parts. One is behavior, condition, and outcomes. So, talk about behavior. This is what learners know, or they're able to know, or be able to do, or be able to value. So, basically, that's what constitutes a behavior component in a learning outcomes. Uh, on conditions, context under which learners will be assessed. So, under what condition will you able to assess this learning outcome? Either working individually or in group or using at a particular instrument. Those conditions need to come out very well in a learning outcome. Because in CBET, there are different ways or conditions that you can do your assessments. It can either be on site or at workplace or during industrial attachment or in school or in colleges. So that condition need to be specified. And the last bit is the outcome. And of course, when I talk about learning outcomes, what is the outcome at the end of the day? So, what level of performance is expected? Is it 100% or is it in a straight line, 80%, etc.? So, that constitutes uh, parts of learning outcomes: behavior, conditions, and outcomes. When I talk about measurability of learning outcomes, there are different method of assessment that you can use. One is written assessments. You also have performance assessment. You can as well consider observation as part of assessment and how able to measure the learning outcome. And the other one is portfolio. So if you look at this mind map, then you're able to see different method of measurability of our learning outcomes. So when I talk about written assessment, to give you an example of write an essay that is at least 500 words long. So if you look at that type of learning outcome, you can see the type of verb that has been used. And remember, when you talk about learning outcome affecting your assessment, is which type of verb do you use? So write can only be assessed by written assessments. And then if you focus on the condition that it gives, at least 500 words long. Okay. So when you look at this verb, it tells you exactly which type of assessment I need to conduct. If that is understood, when you're talking about performance, it's the ability of an individual to be able to do something. So how are you able to assess using performance assessment? An example could be design, create, and build a bridge that can support a weight of at least 100 pounds. If you look at that an example and the type of verbs that have been used, for the only way to assess design or build is only through performance. So you need to see the actual thing, how it is performed. Observation is basically able to communicate effectively with the patient in hospital setting. If you look at that example, now the only way to assess communication is just observe and see how it is done. So you can employ observation techniques or assessments. Portfolios, uh, an example is able to develop a marketing plan for a new product. Probably you can see the verb that has been used is develop. So probably you want to see actually see an evidence of a marketing plan is developed. So you realize in measurability, your learning outcomes and how you derive them and the type of verb that you use affects your different type of assessment that you're going to use. So it's good to understand how you're able to derive different learning outcomes and how you're able to measure them. Of course, there are conditions that consideration need to have in assessments on which choice to use. For example, if it's a written assessment or portfolio of evidence or performance assessment, there are certain consideration you need to have in mind. One is the nature of learning outcomes. And talk about the nature of learning outcomes, of course, derives what needs to be actually done or be performed. What's the nature of that learning outcome? Does it constitute uh, development of a product or processes or both, or is about the service? What's the nature of that learning outcomes? Because that affects which type of assessment you're going to use. And of course, issues of resources. Another consideration that you need to have is the purpose of assessment. Why are you doing that assessment? Is it to assess processes, products? Yeah. What's the purpose of that assessment? Why are you doing it? So it needs to come out, and you need to consider that aspect when it comes to assessment. You also need to factor issues of resources. When we started, we said the CBET is a resource intensive approach, and therefore need to really reconsider your resource availability. Yeah. So when you're conducting this assessment, focus on different resources that you need for you to conduct a proper assessment of learning outcomes. Maybe at this point, we look at examples of learning outcomes that are unclear, measurable, and measurable compared to those that are clear, measurable learning outcomes. So if you look at the first example of unclear and measurable learning outcome, in this case, if you look at learners will understand the concept of photosynthesis. So this learning outcome is unclear. The aspects what a learner need to do. Is it able to be measured? Can you able to measure understanding? So if you paraphrase that into clear, measurable learning outcomes, it could go by learners will be able to explain the process of photosynthesis using diagram that includes the following steps. So you can include all the steps. So you can see it contains the three parts of a clear, measurable learning outcomes. So there is behavior, there is conditions. You can see the condition is using a diagram, and of course the learning, uh, of course the outcome. So you can define all unclear learning outcome to make them clear and measurable. Another example could be learners will be able to write a persuasive essay. It's very unclear again because there are some components that are missing. Then you can paraphrase that to learners will be able to write a persuasive essay that is at least 500 words. You see the condition long, and that includes clear thesis statement, supporting evidence and conclusions. So you can see the outcomes. And therefore, if you look at the difference, clear measurable learning outcomes will give you an idea of what you're able to support this learner to achieve the learning outcomes. So today, just to summarize what you have talked about, is we are looking at clear, measurable learning outcomes and how it's able to affect your content delivery in terms of active learner strategies that you're going to use, and of course the assessment. Moving forward in our next video, we'll unpack the third principle, and that will be on reflective learning, and we'll be able to look at how you're able to reflect. Thank you. And for those who have subscribed, thank you for your support. And for those who haven't, please subscribe. Our target is to reach 100 subscribers. And I hope we are learning something from how we're able to deliver CBET in a proper way. Thank you.